He walked into the courtroom with slow, deliberate steps, refusing to look overwhelmed. His chin lifted slightly, not in pride, but in a controlled calm that made people watch him closely. The room was full, yet he seemed untouched by the eyes following him. He sat down, hands folded in front of him, movements steady and silent. No fidgeting, no restless shifting. It was as if he wanted everyone to see that he was unshaken. The officers around him remained alert, but he didn't look at them. He stared forward, expression fixed, unreadable, guarded. Reporters whispered quietly, capturing every detail, every angle of his posture, waiting for any sign of fear or regret. There was none. Kyle didn't look like a teenager on trial for murder. He looked like someone who refused to be broken. His smirk wasn't loud or careless. It was a small curve at the corner of his mouth, subtle enough that someone could mistake it for calm if they weren't paying attention. But those who understood body language recognized it for what it was: defiance. He leaned back slightly in his chair, shoulders loose, as though the courtroom was simply another room he had passed through before. His eyes were steady, without apology, without explanation, without fear. When the judge entered, most people naturally straightened, but Kyle didn't shift. He held his posture, his silence, his stillness. It was a statement without words. His attorney whispered to him, trying to guide his reaction, but Kyle barely nodded, gaze locked forward. He was determined not to show anything. To him, silence wasn't weakness. Silence was loyalty. Silence was power. Inside the courtroom, the gravity of the case settled over everyone present. This wasn't just another trial. It involved the death of Officer Arnulfo Crispin, a name spoken with respect throughout the community. The weight of that uniform, the responsibility it represented, and the life behind it made the room feel tighter, quieter, heavier. Everyone understood what this trial meant. The prosecution prepared stacks of documents, photographs, and reports. They were organized, focused, ready to draw a clear line between the evidence and the young man sitting silently at the defense table. Their case wasn't built on speculation. It was built on statements, forensics, and the chilling quiet that followed the fatal shot. The defense sat beside Kyle, knowing the challenge ahead. Their job wasn't just to argue innocence. It was to separate Kyle from the image being painted, a teenager who acted without hesitation, without concern for consequences. And still, Kyle remained still. No guilt, no fear, no apology visible on his face. The courtroom felt his silence like a wall. Kyle grew up in a neighborhood where toughness wasn't just encouraged. It was necessary. The streets around him didn't reward softness or hesitation. They rewarded whoever learned the rules fast, who kept their head down, who didn't fold when challenged. Kids didn't get to stay kids for long there. They learned survival, younger than they learned trust. At home, things weren't much easier. Stability came and went in uncertain waves. The adults in his life were stretched thin, working long hours or handling their own struggles. Kyle learned quickly that no one was coming to save him. Responsibility for himself fell on his own shoulders. Independence wasn't empowerment, it was defense. School didn't offer him much refuge either. Teachers noticed his talent, but they also noticed the anger simmering beneath the surface. When he felt cornered, he didn't argue. He shut down. He learned to speak through silence. So when older boys on the block took interest in him, offering belonging and identity, it didn't feel dangerous. It felt like family. The code Kyle lived by didn't come from books or rules posted anywhere. It came from faces, tones, and consequences he witnessed growing up. The message was repeated in 1,000 unspoken ways. You do not talk. You do not betray. you do not break. Loyalty wasn't something earned. It was enforced. The idea of silence became more than defense. It became identity. Speaking to police, cooperating with authority, admitting fault, those things weren't mistakes in his world. They were unforgivable. To be labeled a snitch meant losing every shred of respect you had, no matter who you were or what you had survived. The older boys showed him how to carry himself, how to walk, how to look unbothered, even when fear clawed at his chest. They taught him that emotion could be used against you, and that the only safe face to show was a blank one. So by the time he sat in that courtroom, surrounded by police, lawyers, reporters, and grieving family, his silence wasn't confusion. It was the only language he had ever trusted. On the night of the incident, Kyle wasn't alone. He was with a group of boys he had known for years, boys who moved together, spoke in short sentences, and trusted silence more than explanation. They were gathered in a park, doing what they always did, staying out late, drifting between shadows, pretending the night made them invincible. It was familiar, almost routine. When Officer Arnulfo Crispin approached, the atmosphere shifted. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't hostile. He was doing his job, checking on a group of teenagers out past dark. But in Kyle's world, authority didn't feel like safety. It felt like a threat to identity. The officer didn't raise his voice. He simply began a standard pat-down procedure, asking questions, trying to understand who he was dealing with. But tension doesn't need volume to rise. It only needs fear. Every boy in that group felt the moment tighten. The loyalty code hung in the air like a held breath, and Kyle was right in the center of it. The moment of conflict came quickly, without warning and without time to think. Officer Crispin's hand moved as part of the routine search, but in that instant, Kyle's world narrowed. It didn't matter whether the officer spoke calmly or firmly. All Kyle saw was authority closing in, the kind he had spent his life resisting. There was no conversation, no argument, no exchange of words that changed anything. Just movement. Sudden and irreversible. A flash of fear disguised as reaction. A decision made in a single beat of the heart. And then, the sound that would echo far beyond that night. The other boys froze, stunned into silence. The reality of what had just happened didn't register immediately. Their minds scrambled, grasping for explanation, but there was none that made sense. The world went still, and as Officer Crispin collapsed, the moment shattered. Everything that came next would be shaped by that one irreversible second. The scene broke apart the moment the officer hit the ground. Panic didn't look loud or chaotic. It looked like wide eyes, fast breathing, and bodies moving before thoughts could catch up. The boys scattered instinctively, running not because they understood what had happened, but because their world taught them that staying meant being caught. Kyle ran with them, feet hitting the pavement hard, heart racing in his chest. No one spoke a word. There were no plans, no decisions made together. Just movement. Each step pushed them farther from the reality they didn't yet know how to face. The silence between them was heavy, pressing, filled with a fear none of them had the language to express. As they disappeared into the night, the chaos behind them grew. Officers rushed to the scene, radios crackled, voices rose. The situation shifted from routine to emergency in seconds. What began as a simple patrol stop had erupted into tragedy. The city didn't know it yet, but that moment would ripple outward, through families, through neighborhoods, through headlines, through courtrooms, changing lives that never even stood in that park. Once the scene was secured, investigators began piecing together what had happened. They followed footprints, tire marks, and witness statements, tracing the escape route step by step. The area around the park became a web of taped-off boundaries and flashing lights. Officers moved with urgency, understanding the weight of the crime. The shooting of one of their own shifted the tone from investigation to pursuit. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors long after midnight. Some people stayed silent. Others whispered what they had seen from windows or porches. Most knew the boys involved, or at least recognized their faces. The streets remember everything, even when people don't speak. Eventually, names surfaced, and with names came direction. Kyle Williams became the focal point, not because he confessed, but because the evidence quietly pointed toward him. A piece here, a statement there, and the pattern began to form. Forensics confirmed what the investigators suspected. The gun, the flight path, the eyewitness placements, they didn't tell a perfect story, but they told enough. The case had momentum now. The silence that protected Kyle was starting to crack. When detectives brought Kyle in for questioning, the interview room felt smaller than the courtroom. There were no cameras flashing, no crowd watching, just fluorescent lights and a table between him and the investigators. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't threaten him. They spoke calmly, giving him every chance to explain. But Kyle stared back with the same expression he had carried in with him, empty, steady, unwavering. Every question they asked received the same answer: silence or denial. It wasn't nervousness. It was commitment. Kyle believed that saying nothing was strength. The less he spoke, the more control he felt he still had. He was following the only rule he trusted. The detectives tried different approaches: reasoning, empathy, pressure, but nothing reached him. Kyle didn't flinch when they mentioned the officer's family. He didn't break when they described the seriousness of the charges. His face stayed locked in that controlled calm. To the investigators, it felt like talking to a closed door. But to Kyle, silence was loyalty. And he believed loyalty would protect him. He hadn't yet realized that loyalty only works when it's shared. The loyalty Kyle believed in began to shift the moment the investigation gained momentum. The boys who were with him that night were brought in one by one. At first, their stories matched his silence, brief answers and shrugged shoulders. But time changes courage. Fear changes priorities. When investigators explained the consequences, the boys realized the streets could not protect them here. Some of them had never faced a real courtroom. Some had never imagined a world where silence could cost them decades. They began to talk, slowly, hesitantly, then clearly. Each testimony added another thread, weaving a narrative Kyle couldn't undo. Names were spoken, movements described, roles clarified. For Kyle, this was the deepest betrayal. These were the people he believed would stand solid beside him, the ones who knew the code, the ones who had taught him to never break. Yet now, they were choosing survival over loyalty. And he was left sitting alone. The silence he trusted was starting to feel like abandonment. As the trial continued, the courtroom took on a different energy. The prosecution presented evidence with increasing confidence. Their tone sharpened. Their questions grew more precise, and every witness seemed to move the narrative in the same direction. Kyle remained still, but even stillness can look strained under pressure. People in the seats behind him shifted uncomfortably. Some stared at him, wondering how someone so young could sit so unaffected in the middle of something so life-altering. Others watched the prosecutor, studying the way each point was laid down with care, building a case brick by brick. The defense felt the shift too. They whispered more, reorganized notes, tried to anticipate what piece of evidence was coming next. But the momentum wasn't theirs to hold. The courtroom wasn't waiting for their argument. It was watching the story unfold on its own, and Kyle's silence was slowly becoming part of the evidence. Kyle's attorney worked carefully, trying to create distance between Kyle and the act itself. He questioned the reliability of witness memories and pointed out inconsistencies. He suggested fear had influenced statements, that panic could blur truth. He didn't try to paint Kyle as innocent. He tried to paint the situation as unclear. He reminded the jury that none of the boys had stepped forward until pressure was applied, that memories shared under fear may not be trustworthy. He asked them to consider hesitation, confusion, the chaos of the night. He wanted them to wonder if the story was being shaped by the need for closure instead of fact. For a moment, his arguments hung in the air. Reasonable doubt is powerful, if it can take root. But the prosecution had structured their narrative carefully, preventing uncertainty from spreading. Each counterpoint was met with evidence, each question with clarity. The defense tried, but they were pushing against a tide. Throughout the testimonies and cross-examinations, Kyle didn't move. His composure was unsettling to some. They expected fear, guilt, or remorse, something human. Instead, he remained unreadable. The same blank stare, the same rigid jaw, the same controlled breathing. Some believed it was coldness. Others believed it was shock. But those who understood the street code recognized it instantly. He was holding the line. If he showed emotion, if he reacted, if he broke even for a moment, that meant the world he came from would say he failed. The courtroom could not understand the weight of that invisible audience. The rules of the streets were not written here, yet Kyle lived by them even under oath and judgment. His silence was his last defense. His face was his last shield. But shields eventually get heavy. Kyle's mother spoke softly when she addressed the court. Her voice trembled, but her words were steady. She talked about the boy she raised, the one who smiled easily, the one who cared deeply, the one who used to act silly in the kitchen while music played. She didn't deny the situation. She pleaded for understanding. She said he had been influenced, shaped, pulled into something he didn't fully see at the time. She said he had been trying to survive in a world that rewarded toughness more than kindness. Her pain filled the room differently than the prosecution's arguments did. Some jurors looked at her with sympathy. Others kept their faces neutral, committed to separating emotion from responsibility. But no one in the room was untouched by her grief. Love does not erase consequences, but consequences do not erase love. When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the courtroom exhaled all at once. Hours passed slowly. People shifted in their seats, paced hallways, stared at clocks. The attorneys sat silently with their thoughts. Kyle stayed still, hands folded, gaze distant, like someone trapped inside a memory. No one knew which direction the jury would lean. The evidence was strong, but the defendant was young. The crime was heavy, but the motivations were complicated. The possibility of the death penalty hung like a shadow over every thought. Families waited with different kinds of fear. One fearing loss, one fearing permanence. The weight of judgment pressed down on everyone equally, even though only one life would change by the final decision. When the courtroom doors finally opened, the air shifted again. Deliberation was over. The truth was coming. The jurors walked in carefully, faces composed, carrying the weight of what they were about to speak. Kyle did not shift in his chair. His hands did not tremble. He stared forward, unblinking. The courtroom held still. The foreperson read the verdict slowly. Guilty of first-degree murder. The words echoed, even though they were spoken only once. Kyle did not react. His expression did not change. The silence was louder than any outburst could have been. The acknowledgement that the victim was a law enforcement officer added weight to the conviction. The room sat in stunned quiet. On one side, grief tightened into something sharp. On the other, shock finally broke into tears. And Kyle, for the first time, truly had nothing to say. When the verdict settled, Kyle's posture changed. Not dramatically, not suddenly. His shoulders lowered slightly, and his jaw unclenched. His breath shook just once. It was the smallest crack, but in a life built on silence, it was everything. He lifted his hands to his face, wiping quickly, as though trying to erase the betrayal of tears. His chest rose unevenly. The control he had protected so fiercely slipped for the first time. Not because of guilt, not because of guilt, but because reality had finally reached him. The world he believed would protect him, the code, the silence, the loyalty, was nowhere around him now. He was alone in a room full of people, and the weight was too much to hold. The judge spoke with measured clarity. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision had been made carefully, with consideration and gravity. It was final. Kyle listened, tears drying on his cheeks, trying to rebuild the wall that had cracked. But some walls, once opened, never closed the same way again. He stood slowly, hands guided behind him, the sound of cuffs clicking into place unmistakable. His mother cried, reaching out though she could not touch him. The courtroom watched quietly. The law had spoken. The room felt hollow in the aftermath. Kyle was escorted away, each step heavier than the last. Life would no longer be measured in days of freedom, but in years counted behind bars. Loyalty had been everything to Kyle. Loyalty to the streets, loyalty to silence, loyalty to a code that promised respect, but delivered destruction. He had believed that holding firm made him strong, but loyalty without wisdom is a trap, and silence without reflection is a cage. The streets did not stand beside him in court. The code did not testify in his defense. The loyalty he protected did not protect him in return. 2 lives were lost that night, one to death and one to a cell. And the question remains, was that loyalty ever worth the price?